2025 will be the year of the fighting nerds.
The fighting nerds are the guys that are different.
Caio Borralho!
We put everything on the line to achieve our dreams.
Carlos Prates.
Smooth, calm, violent, absolutely nasty combos. This dude is absolutely in the UFC.
I think the future is be a champ, of course, because I'm planning to get back to the gym, to learn, to train hard every day.
Jean Silva!
We think, we study, we fight, we evolve. That's our philosophy.
The fighting nerds were put on the map in 2024, led by Jean Silva, Carlos Prates, and Caio Borralho, as all three of those guys had undefeated 2024s while also putting up extremely impressive fights, extremely impressive finishes, and overall just look like extremely impressive fighters. But I'm here to tell you, although 2024 was an amazing year for the fighting nerds, 2025 is going to take their gym to the next level. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy MMA, I make opinionative MMA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that like button, subscribe button, and that post notification bell. But anyways, let's get into it. Ever since making it to the UFC, Jean Silva has looked to be one of the more impressive prospects we have in the entire UFC. As after having a pretty impressive Dana White Contender Series performance, 2024 was the first full year that he was with the company. And in his 3 fights that he fought in 2024, he had 3 wins and 3 finishes over some really impressive competition. As he was able to beat Weston Wilson in his UFC debut by first round TKO, he was able to beat Charles Jourdain in the second round via TKO as well, and Jourdain has been somebody who's never been knocked out in the UFC thus far, and in his most recent fight, he was able to finish Drew Dober via doctor stoppage, and that fight was an absolute bloodbath. He was able to dominate Drew for the most part throughout that entirety of the fight, and he just looked extremely impressive. But a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, how has Jean Silva looked to be so impressive so early on into his UFC career? Well, in my opinion, it comes down to 2 factors, but the first and most obvious is due to his skill set. Because when you watch Silva out there, it's pretty clear that this guy is extremely technical and extremely effective on the feet. In a lot of his fights, he does get into brawls, but what he does when getting into those brawls is he stays very technical. And due to the fact that he's very physical out there, he hits very hard, he can take a shot well, while also being very technical on the feet, is where he finds his success. And as I mentioned before, all 3 of the guys that he fought in 2024, he was able to finish, and he was able to finish 2 guys that are extremely hard to finish. He was able to finish Charles Jourdain, who I mentioned has never been knocked out up until that fight, and he was also able to finish Drew Dober, who has one of the better chins in the entire UFC. So it's pretty clear that this guy can put an absolute beating on virtually anybody at 155 pounds. But the other factor for why I think Silva has looked so great so early on into his UFC career thus far is something that I touched upon before, but is his overall physicality. Because I mentioned this in a lot of my videos, but when you look at some of the champs in the UFC, or even some of the top 5 fighters in the UFC, one thing that a lot of these guys have in common is obviously the skill, but outside that is the overall physicality. Because when you look at some of the champs throughout the UFC, you talk about Alex Pereira, Ilia Topuria, Dricus du Plessis, even Alexandre Pantoja at the lower weight class, one thing that all of these guys have in common is they're extremely physical. And what I mean by that is they're able to take shots very well, and they're also able to hit extremely hard. And when you look at Jean Silva, he also has that commonality, as this guy is very, very physical. And that has been something that he's shown throughout his entire 3-fight UFC career thus far. So overall, due to the 2 reasons that I mentioned, his overall skill and his overall physicality is a huge reason for why I think Silva has been so effective thus far, and a huge reason for why I think he's going to have a very bright future ahead of him. But now, let's move on to Caio Borralho. So similar to Jean Silva, ever since making to the UFC, Borralho has been undefeated. But although he was undefeated early on in his UFC career, as in 2022, he he went 3-0. In 2023, he went 2-0. 5 of his 6 fights in his UFC up until that point were decision victories, as the only finish he was able to get was over Olajaychuk, and that was a submission victory. And going into 2024, a lot of fans were somewhat concerned or somewhat questioning how good Borralho could truly get, because up until that point, he was fighting some of the lower level competition that the middleweight had to offer, and he wasn't able to get a lot of finishes at all. But in 2024, that completely changed. As his first fight at UFC 301, he went up against Paul Craig, and he was able to finish him by TKO in a very dominant performance. But although Borralho was able to put on a really impressive performance, there still was some doubt and haters out there, as Paul Craig was notoriously known as a guy that was very bad on the feet, and really the only danger that he does pose is on the ground via submissions. But after his fight against Paul Craig, his next fight was going to be up against Jared Cannonier, and this was a real test for Borralho, as by far Cannonier was the best fighter he's ever fought, and Cannonier has been a guy who's been at the top of the middleweight division for some time now. And that fight turned out to be a really good one, as it was really close until the latter half of that fight, as in rounds 4 and 5, Borralho really turned it on, as he was essentially able to get the finish late in that fight. I know the ref didn't stop it, but most other refs probably would have stopped that fight, but regardless, Borralho was able to get a decision victory against his toughest competition yet. And after that Cannonier fight, the overall public sentiment over Caio Borralho completely changed, as at this point a lot of people see Borralho as one of the top fighters in the middleweight division right now, and a guy who has a real chance to become the champ in the near future. And Borralho was able to get to this point due to his overall skill. Obviously he's extremely talented both on the feet and on the ground, but also due to his great physicality, as he does hit very hard and he's able to take a punch pretty well, although I will say he does have really good footwork and is very defensively sound, and he doesn't get hit all that much. But now let's talk about Carlos Prates, because this is arguably the guy from the Fighting Nerds that fans are the most excited about, as ever since getting to the UFC, he's obviously gotten all finishes: a second round TKO versus Trevin Giles, a first round TKO versus Radke, a second round TKO versus the Leech, and the Leech has been a guy who hasn't been knocked out up until that point, and he was also able to finish Neil Magny in the first round, which up until that point was probably his toughest test yet. In my opinion, it was probably the Leech, but regardless, everybody that he fought in the UFC thus far, he was able to finish. And a huge reason for why he's able to do so is due to a few different things actually. First is due to his incredible frame. Obviously he has very long limbs, very long legs, and very long arms, which allow him to do two separate things. He's able to generate a ton of power, a ton of torque into the shots that he does throw, but he's also able to utilize that reach to stay at distance and to stay safe for the most part. And in all of those fights that he's had thus far in the UFC, he's looked extremely dominant, and he's looked to use that reach extremely effectively. And in my opinion, going forward from here, we're going to see big things from Carlos Prates. I think it's pretty clear that this guy's able to take a shot, although similar to Caio Borralho, he doesn't take all that many shots, but he's obviously able to hit extremely hard. There's an argument to be made that he's the hardest hitter at the welterweight division. It just seems like if this guy lands one left hand on you, you're going to go to sleep. You're not going to get knocked down or hurt bad, you're probably going to go to sleep, which is just a crazy level of power. And I think going forward, Prates is going to start to fight a higher level of competition. There's already been some rumors that he's going to fight Leon Edwards in his next fight. There's been some rumors he's going to fight JDM in his next fight. And overall, although both of those fights are very tough ones, both of those fighters are extremely talented, I do think Prates has a real chance to shine in either one of those fights, specifically in the Leon fight. I do think the Leon fight is a really good stylistic matchup for Prates, because Leon does tend to fight at range. He does his best work at range, which is something that Prates does as well. And of course, Prates has a lot more power than Leon does. So if Prates is able to land one left hand, I do think he can knock out Leon at will, and I just think that's a relatively good stylistic matchup for Prates. And if he does fight Leon in his next fight and he is able to win, especially via finish, that's really going to throw his career into a really good position and probably could potentially get a title shot in the near future as well. But overall, when you look at the Fighting Nerds, you look at Jean Silva, Carlos Prates, and Caio Borralho, it's pretty clear that all three of these guys have two things in common. Of course, they're very skilled in their respective avenues. When you talk about Jean Silva or Carlos Prates, you talk about their striking ability, you talk about Borralho as a really well-rounded overall fighter, both striking and on the ground, but also all three of these guys are extremely physical. And I think going forward from here, in 2025 and beyond, the fighting nerds are going to have an extremely bright future ahead of themselves, and I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if not only do the fighting nerds have one champion, but they have multiple champions in the near future. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the fighting nerds have a very bright future ahead of themselves, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out guys.